people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down.
Hello and welcome to episode 59 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Dan Heaton and my partner in podcasting today is Mike Swaddling, the co-founder of the Croydon Constitutionalists. Mike, it's been a while. How are you and what have you been up to?
Yeah, good. It has been a while, Dan. It has been a while, listeners. So good to be back talking to you all again. Yeah, well, we've both been busy. We've been travelling around, and we've been. I've been working a lot and enjoying some of these freedom things that we used to thought were our God-given rights. But I've only just got back again. So yeah, it's been the summer, and as we move into autumn, I dare say we might get a few more of these in.
Yeah, you mentioned we've been on our travels over the in August and been to a few places around the country to meet some fellow liberty lovers. Mike, why don't you tell the listeners about what we've been up to?
Yeah, we went on a little summer tour. Neither of us being entirely convinced about the ability to go abroad, although I do know lots of people have now, and it seems not so bad. But earlier in the summer, we went for a little tour. We went to one of the Third Wednesday clubs, Libertarian Drinks of Dick Denningball, over in Ledbury. Fabulous little town. I know, a really good night out. And we'll be talking more about that later on. We also went for a trip to see Chris of the Libertarian Listener and Dan of both of them for Independence from Liberty up in Lichfield and Colville. So met up with some people that we've known sort of online through lockdown, and we knew perhaps a little bit before that, but hadn't had the opportunity to meet up. So it was really good to go and see them. Yeah, and of course, absolutely. We went to your old stomping ground.
Oh, Wolverhampton.
Indeed.
We did indeed, and you got to see the fantastic Molineux Stadium.
Yes.
So that was nice. Well, enough about our travels. We're delighted to be joined again on the podcast by Peter Sonnex, former soldier and Brexit Party Parliamentary candidate here in Croydon. Peter, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan and Mike, for having me again.
So, Mike, as I said, it's been a little while since we did the last podcast. What are we going to talk about today?
So we've got a few topics to cover. The COVID passports and the will we, won't we, hokey cokey that they have become. The upcoming referendum in Croydon on the 7th of October for a directly elected mayor. Some recent news, sort of breaking news overnight as we record this, from Angela Raynor and what she thinks of you and the fact that you might be scum. And talking to Peter more seriously about the withdrawal from Afghanistan and his thoughts and experiences from his life around that. I'll also cover off what we've been, some of our articles on our website and some events we've got coming up.
Excellent. So yes, the COVID passport debacle looks like they're coming in Scotland because Queen Nicola has said so. But we don't really know what's happening in England, do we? We were told some time ago by the government that we're not a country where you're asked to see your papers. So we'll never do that. Then we were told that they were looking at it very, very seriously and that they might be brought in by the end of September. But at the time, we were not sure whether they were joking or not. Seemed like a crazy idea and going completely against what they'd previously said. And indeed, it almost seemed as if it was a stick with which to sort of beat the youngsters through to the clinic to get their vaccinations, and then just recently we've been told, oh no, not for now. But they may get involved in the Plan B for the plan for the winter. So it's really not clear whether we're going to have these things or not. Mike, any idea what's going on?
It it seems to me that Boris Sardi, an ID card Johnson, has decided we're going to have a medical ID card, and the problem is they kind of pushed it too far, and there's probably just enough MPs against it, and there's just enough public opinion against it that they need to find their excuse. And you know, I'm almost tempted to say they're kicking themselves that COVID rates are so low at the moment. Not that who knows what rates mean, but or infection rates mean, but they're kicking themselves. They haven't got the opportunity to bring them in yet. And that sounds very cynical. I think it's kind of panned out by so much that they've been doing that. There's no obvious reason for these. They're a terrible affront to civil liberties. If being vaccinated meant you couldn't spread the disease, you might make a case, but that's not the case. Vaccination protects you, it doesn't protect others, in which case, what's the purpose of a passport? Other than to say, you're one of the good people, you're one of the people we approve of, and we'll let you in. And that's an appalling way to run things in a free society.
Indeed. Peter, what's your take been on this?
Yeah, I think the government is being less than honest with us, and they're not exactly engendering trust. I'm part of an organisation called the Together Declaration, and we've got a hashtag out on Twitter, #Together. We were marching in London yesterday with other organisations against vaccine passports, against mandatory vaccination of, for instance, healthcare workers, and absolutely against the vaccination of healthy children. With the Together Declaration, the website, togetherdeclaration.org, it's got a form of words on there on a letter that you might want to write to your MP, for instance. And I did that. I wrote to my MP, Gareth Bacon, Orpington, highlighting a number of issues, about 6 points whereby, you know, vaccine passports were as unnecessary as they were discriminatory, that they were not something that were in keeping at all with our British values. He wrote back to me very kindly, 3 lines in a letter, and I'll just read those to you if I may. Dear Mr. Sonnex, thank you for your email dated 9th of September. As you may now be aware, the Health Secretary has announced that vaccine passports are no longer being pursued by the UK's, no longer being pursued given the UK's high vaccine uptake and testing rates. Second paragraph, I warmly welcome this announcement and trust it will come as no small measure of reassurance. Yours sincerely, Gareth Bacon, MP. I mean, that letter, that reply was, I think, as dismissive as it was anything else, and that it's written in absolute terms. Now, I think I may well hold Mr. Bacon to his response in absolute terms. The government, you know, has announced that vaccine passports are no longer being pursued. That's it. No caveats, no conditions, no other clauses. Am I reassured by that? Are you, Mike? Are you, Dan, reassured by Mr. Bacon's response?
It wouldn't be the first time a government minister has said they're not looking to do it before they've decided they are looking to do it. But it is positive that he's felt able to say it in quite strong terms.
It's strong terms, as I say, unconditional in that respect. Mr. Bacon is part of the Common Sense group, as they call themselves in Parliament. However, I don't see him, you know, voting against emergency measures. I don't see him voting against any of the other aspects that have clearly been going against the flow of what we might regard as common sense. I think Mr. Bacon probably has ministerial ambition himself. And of course, we know that most politicians will look after their own interests, their political careers, their party interests, parliamentary interests. And I'm very much afraid that the country, you and me, and their constituents are a long way down a list of other priorities for them.
Well, you only have to see the, we won't go on to talk about this too much today, but you only have to see the reaction to the national insurance rise. It's apparently going to pay for social care and what have you, and all the COVID backlogs in the NHS. How many MPs moaned about it, but because there was a potential reshuffle on the cards, not so many of them voted against it.
Does any of us here think that we won't see vaccine passports make a comeback in some way, shape, or form? I don't believe the issue's over in any way.
I don't think it's over at all. I think they're on their way. Money is being spent on contracting. And perhaps most worrying, I think, is this recent development, the last couple of days, that the UK government has been in talks with the institutions of the EU, heaven forbid, having taken back control, is that we're looking at subscribing to the EU-wide scheme that's currently there. Now, that scheme, yes, it's an international passport. It allows for international travel, and that's something really for sovereign states to determine who they bring into their country and who they don't. But it is also the very same device that is used in Europe to gain access to restaurants, pubs, clubs, shopping malls, and in France, even to your local hospital. So if we are in talks with the EU over adopting that EU-wide passport scheme, then that sounds to me as though we're pursuing a vaccine passport for domestic use as well.
I mean, we've certainly seen, as you say, vaccine passports now being used in various countries on the continent, and effectively also in some cities and some states in America now. New York City has a vaccine mandate in terms of if you want to go into bars and places like that. How heavily it's being monitored, I'm not sure yet, but some places that you really think, land of the free and all that sort of thing, well, some parts of it certainly aren't.
I certainly hear in Manhattan it is. I don't know about the others. I wouldn't be shocked to find that it's less well monitored in the Bronx. But
I think that's probably true.
But yeah, no, Manhattan, absolutely. Which is, of course, incredibly discriminatory if you know about vaccine rates in different communities in New York and the US generally.
Well, that's enough about COVID just for now. Hopefully we won't get these passports for domestic use anyway. And but as we say, the government says one thing one day and another the next. So by the time of the next podcast, it could have all changed. One thing which is going to possibly change soon is the way that Croydon Council is run, because the referendum is upon us. On the 7th of October, the good people of Croydon will be going to the polls to decide whether or not to have an elected mayor to actually run the council as a sort of executive position, rather than it being run by basically the party with the most councillors, as it is at present, known as the strong leader model. We've talked about this a bit before, and the pros and the cons of it. Mike, what have you made so far of the actual campaigns, though, as we come up to the final furlong?
It's been quite interesting to see a local referendum campaign in this sense, just to see how it would be done. It is very broadly a Conservative campaign for a mayor and a Labour campaign against a mayor. Now, that's not entirely fair in that there is a Croydon South Labour are also for a mayor. But in terms of boots on the street, it is the Conservatives in the south of the borough and the middle that are getting out leaflets, and Labour in the north. Although I think the campaign has been leafleting quite heavily in the north of the borough and around some of the stations. So it's been a very leaflet-focused one. And for many people, and I know we've had this conversation quite a few times with different people who see social media as the way to do things, and there is undoubtedly some social media postings. This is actually, the professionals, the groups that are fighting this, professionals or at least enthusiastic amateurs, are all very leaflet focused, which is interesting, and public meetings. So it's a physical event rather than a virtual event. And I think anyone running for office should keep that in mind, that often campaigning is a physical activity. What do I make of the campaigns? There's not been very much against it. Labour have come to the party very late and fairly weakly. I think DEMOC have struggled to gain a really large momentum, but Chris Philp has put a huge amount of campaigning behind it with the Conservatives. So I would think, famous last words, they're likely to win quite handily. I think Labour have created a problem for themselves in that they have become so against it. You wonder how they're going to have to be able to nominate and enthusiastically get behind a mayoral candidate should they need to.
Well, that will be one of the problems. Should the referendum be the vote in favour of the democratically elected mayor, which you think would be likely, because you'd think that the people who want to change things are more likely to bother to go out and vote, because there's no other elections on the same day. So I'm not sure that Labour are able to get their electorate out to vote the way that they want them to. We've had some interesting literature through from the Labour Party, and certainly they are presenting it as a Conservative plot to waste money, essentially. Talking about it's going to cost £1 million or some such to have a mayor. It's going to be so much more expensive than the current model. I've seen absolutely no evidence of that, and it beggars belief that Labour can say anything about wasting money when they've what they've done in Croydon Council.
Absolutely, I made this point. We had a debate in the Coulson and Purley Debating Society. So we had a representative from both camps debate there, and good of them both to do it. It was a fairly enthusiastic vote in favour of a mayor, but then they were debating in Coulson and Purley, so I wouldn't want to read too much into that. And two people that have been on the committee were in the audience and are members of the society. So but I made that very point. Actually, even if it did cost £1 million, and it won't, this is a ridiculous number they've just pulled out of nowhere. Unless they're saying, and Steve Reed has been repeating this quite a lot recently, unless Steve Reed's saying that Labour in Croydon can't be trusted not to splash £1 million for no good reason on this, therefore we shouldn't have it. That's the only way it could cost £1 million. But even if it did cost £1 million, if it got someone in that, I don't know, didn't overspend on the Fairfield Halls by 12 million, didn't overspend on Paddington Leisure Centre by 10 million, didn't buy a shopping centre and a hotel for over 80 million, didn't leave £250 million to Brick by Brick that they've got no hope of ever getting back. If it just led to someone that didn't need to pay 10 grand for someone to defecate on stage, this million would be well worth it. Well worth it.
So, Peter, obviously you don't actually live quite inside the boundaries of the fair borough of Croydon. But, which way do you think this is going to go?
I live literally in the next door constituency, but I very much hope it goes with the democratically elected mayor. I think it's in keeping with empowerment of our local authorities, but with that empowerment has to come some accountability and the ability to hold people to account. But on promises made by that strong leadership model. I truly hope that DEMOC succeeds in the referendum and that a success is made of it subsequently.
Yeah, well, we'll find out on the 7th.
Could just quickly add, we would like to bring you updates from both campaigns, but neither of them deemed it worthwhile speaking to the campaign that fronted over 45% of the people in Croydon voting for us to leave. It appears that for all the change we're after, no one in Croydon is actually willing to accept the referendum of 2016 yet, or no one in Croydon politics at least.
Well, I don't think it's just Croydon where we've found people who are not prepared to accept the results of referendum, is it?
A masterful link, and you're not wrong.
and one of those, Angela Raynor, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, she's had some very strong words to say about a certain type of people. She was speaking at a fringe event the night before we're recording this podcast. And she said the following whilst speaking to some of the delegates there. And I'll read this out, shall I? Because probably my accent's the nearest to hers, I think. I'm sick of shouting from the sidelines. I bet yous lot are too. We cannot get any worse than a bunch of scum, homophobic, racist, misogynistic, absolute pile of banana republic, Etonian piece of scum. And I held back a little that I have not seen in my life. Mike, apart from the fact that that was some sort of like Labour Party bingo buzzword expressions, what on earth is she going on about?
Well, I could have closed my eyes there and pictured her as you said that. So close was it? But I mean, it just, it's beyond belief, isn't it? This is the deputy leader of the Labour Party. This is an elected MP. This is someone who is meant to be a leader in her brand of politics, and potentially, you know, there for the last 100 years, the government has only been run by one party or the other by one of two parties, and she's a deputy leader of one of them. She could potentially be a future Prime Minister in waiting, senior cabinet member, and she's saying this. It's an appalling way to speak in her position, and it's a nonsense way to speak in almost any position. There's nothing there about what they've done. There's nothing there about a policy or a platform or an issue they've got. It's just a bunch of bile. You know, I heard a Spectator podcast earlier, and they mentioned, and this was before it was recorded yesterday, before this has come out, possibly before it was even said. And the podcast ended with someone from Spectator, I can't remember who it was, saying rather than running on a strategy of winning the next election, they're running on a strategy of winning the one after. I think Angela Raynor has actually made it the one after that.
But don't worry though, because actually she's clarified her views now. I see she was talking to Trevor Phillips earlier today, and she says she wasn't talking about people who voted Conservative or whatever, or for Brexit or anything. She was just talking about the Prime Minister. Peter, what do you make of this new, kinder, gentler form of politics?
Well, it's very difficult to know, to which constituency Angela Raynor was referring, and you're saying there, it was purely referring to the Prime Minister very specifically, rather than to the deplorables more generally. Interesting, this morning on the Andrew Marr show, we had Keir Starmer, asked if he either associated himself with the remarks or if he would denounce them in some way and demand an apology from Angela Raynor. We got something that I think many of us could have scripted before he even said it, that Angela had her own voice, she had her own way of doing things. It's not what he would have said, and would not be asking her to apologize, which is as weak, I regret, as it's pathetic, but we've come to expect it. He then did say, when pressed, that he would be having words with Ms. Rayner later on today, but that would not be to extract an apology for what she said. Splinters on his backside again, I think.
Indeed. Well, as I said, she seems to have doubled down on these things, albeit she's saying no, it's really just about Boris Johnson. But as you say, Peter, Keir Starmer has failed to condemn these comments.
And nobody, and nobody believes it's just about. I don't believe anyone listens to that and goes or reads that and says that's just about Boris Johnson. She's just said, everyone, we need to vote for us. The majority of the British people have voted for Brexit. The majority, or the plurality, should I say, that voted for the Conservatives, many of whom we need to win over at the next election if we want to win. That's what I think of you. And if she doesn't think, anyone that doesn't think that's how that's being read is completely kidding themselves. I'm happy that Labour's put themselves out of running to form a government. But I just kind of wish we had an opposition to hold the Conservatives in check whilst they were in government. And this kind of comment completely fouls that, doesn't it?
It does indeed. We do definitely need some sort of opposition. Even just to keep the Conservatives to. Well, I was going to say to keep them to their manifesto promises, but half of them have gone out the window, obviously, as we know. But yeah, we do need a strong opposition doing a proper job, without a shadow of a doubt. Well, it's now 20 years on from 9/11, and we've just witnessed some horrendous scenes in Kabul as the Taliban retook the city. Peter, you served in Iraq, I believe, and some other places, although not in Afghanistan. But as a former chief of staff at the Royal School of Military Engineering, we think our listeners would value your insight on this recent development. Mike, I believe you've got some questions for Peter.
Yes, absolutely. And Peter, you reminded us, of course, that your son served twice in Afghanistan. And just leave aside for a moment, if we were right to leave Afghanistan, what do you make of the way we, the British, and overall the American-led forces left the country?
Thank you, Mike. I mean, it really does depend on what we thought we set out to achieve in the first place. If it was to prevent another 9/11, then clearly for 2 decades, we've been successful in that. However, wasn't it really also to transform Afghanistan? This is a country that sits 169th in 186 nations on the planet in per person purchasing power, or GDP. And there was a whole of government, an international effort through the United Nations, through charities, through non-government organizations to push millennium and sustainable development goals for Afghanistan, to provide them with free and fair elections, leading to some sort of democracy, some inclusivity, particularly for women and girls, and equal opportunity more generally. However, in all of that, we simply failed by leaving in the way we did. If the plan, however, was to spend shed loads of our money to make marginal gains, then throw it all away, re-establish the pre-9/11 status quo, then we succeeded. And incredibly, despite the fact you mentioned the horrendous scenes we saw in Kabul, the memory on that is already fading. The government itself, in the way that it does with the narrative, is attempting to call the retreat from Kabul some sort of success. And I'm reminded of what Winston Churchill said of Dunkirk. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. And personally, I feel that's infinitely more the case with Kabul. It was a debacle.
Yes, indeed. And you pointed out about wasting our money. I think we've made the Taliban one of the biggest helicopter fleets in the world, which is it's quite unreal. But how would you have done it differently? So assuming the decision's been made to pull out, what do you think with that given, what do you think we could have done differently to make the retreat from Kabul run more smoothly, if that's possible?
Yes, I think we may have given too much in terms of attributes and competence to our governments, to the United States administration and others on how they perhaps should have gone about this. Surely there are some bright and smart people there who've been to the right schools and so on. Let me start by saying that I would have been much clearer, perhaps even more honest about what we were setting out to achieve in Afghanistan, having a clear vision and intent for our interventions, and most importantly, the bit that I'm afraid is always lost, is actually resourcing them. Having some sort of vision is knowing and articulating what success looks like. What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What are you going to sense when success comes along? And all this stuff, it's simply called strategy. Government talks about strategy all the time, strategy for this and a strategy for that. I don't think they understand it. our staff colleges, our schools for government, business schools, they all major on strategy. And you'd have thought by now that people would have understood it. Strategy is a significant component on university PPE courses that our parliamentarians and their special advisors love so much, though it's clear that the alumni of all of those courses, as evidenced by their actions, they simply spend more time on the politics and rather less on the philosophy and the economics chapters. As for competence and credibility in all of that, and I think that the price that we're going to truly pay as a result of what happened in Kabul and our interventions in Afghanistan is, where does that leave us in terms of trust, competence, and credibility on the world stage? Where does that leave us in terms of our response to the immediate future with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, and ultimately even such things as important as the nuclear deterrent? These are all things that are now just up in the air, whereby trust, competence, and credibility have truly been eroded.
Yes, absolutely. And so, you know, we have gone now, and that was, say, just, you know, not worked out in any way well. What if we hadn't gone now? What could we have done? Do you think we could have stayed for another 20 years, or maybe should we have gone 10 years ago? Where's your sense of what should have been the pull-out point from Afghanistan, if indeed there should be one?
Sure. I mean, this returns again to our vision and intent for the region. It's much more than about a military intervention. I know a lot of people, a lot of commentators, even amongst ourselves, you know, we talk about the military aspects of this and almost compare it to Afghanistan and history, where Afghanistan was the graveyard of empires, and it's become yet another, and yet another empire has a gravestone on that territory. But we started out looking to prevent another 9/11, to put in place a safe and secure environment for all of the other stuff that the United Nations and others wanted to achieve. So yes, ending the military contribution is one thing. However, the thing that's going to truly hurt Afghans in particular is the abandonment of everything else, which will have repercussions for years to come. Yeah, thinking about competence in government and the rest of it, perhaps the international community, the UN, NATO, the United States, and other governments did their cost-benefit analysis, and they decided that now was the time to cut their losses and run, rather than 10 years ago, as you said, Mike. Wait a minute, these are the same strategists, the same people in positions of authority and power who are acting proportionately or otherwise on COVID measures, climate change, energy dependency, immigration, and so on. And I think we can all see that on the basis of common sense, on coherence, on competence to do the analysis, understand the risks and rewards, consider the challenges in a holistic manner. This isn't just about the military. This is a cross-government, cross-agency challenge that has been failed miserably. And things are not looking good for any of us, to be honest, across the board, let alone for the Afghans who are going to suffer most from it.
It's an interesting point you make there. Our governments have decided bright new ideas on how to fix the climate, how to fix disease, but something that they actually should be quite good at, which is dealing with military interventions, because we have, you know, hundreds, thousands of years of experience of that. They can't get that right. Makes you wonder about the competence for the other items. So you've touched upon this being a political question, so let's maybe ask that. So rather than the militarily what we could have done, what do you think we should have done politically different from the start in Afghanistan?
Yeah. Well, I think the start was good. The initial interventions in Afghanistan, yes, they neutralized the threat of another 9/11, but we began to distribute aid. We established assistance teams to develop infrastructure, give them a hydroelectric power capability through the Kajaki Dam project, building roads, connecting communities, building schools. There was some great stuff done at the beginning of the campaign, if I can call it that. All sorts of agencies working terrifically hard, including, and something I was involved in, through the UN, and that was clearance of mines and clearance of other explosive remnants of war in Afghanistan to make the place safer, to allow agriculture to continue. I think it started truly very well, but with regard to strategy, exactly the same challenges as we had in Iraq, and to be honest, just about every other operation that I've been involved on, and that's to ask, what is the exit strategy? How long do we need? What resources do we need to put in? And what are we going to leave behind that is both viable and sustainable for the future? Good strategists, and I include in that, and we've mentioned them earlier, in terms of an effective opposition. They should be challenging the strategy and coming up with strategies of their own. We need an effective opposition. We don't have it. But good strategists are always looking for the pertinent factors, the things that bear on the challenge. They make their deductions. They ask themselves each time they make a deduction, so what? And it's a process. It's dynamic. But it's also predicated on being very clear on the picture of what success looks like and what contributions you are making to that success, and ultimately the exit from it. And we've just got it all wrong. And I don't know how the academics, I don't know how those with business acumen and the like simply haven't grasped that this is a challenge like any other challenge that simply requires clear thinking, good strategy, a view on risk and reward, come up with solutions, come up with some options, have some contingency, above all, have the resources to deal with it. But again, we've failed on it. And as we've touched on, if they can fail on that, they can fail on COVID measures, they can fail on immigration, and on it goes and on it goes. We are suffering from a dearth of competence in the people that hitherto we've sent to Parliament as our elected representatives. And I just hope we look at this as a litany, not of success at all, however the government may want to wrap it up. But look at this very much with our campaigns and our energies in mind when we come to the next general election.
You mentioned an exit strategy there. I often wondered whether our best strategy was almost a never exit strategy. You know, the Americans have never left Germany, Japan, Korea, and those countries seem pretty stable. If we'd gone in with a view of, rather than creating a democracy, we would create a liberal democracy, and you know, liberal might take 100 years before the democracy comes along. You know, Hong Kong was that kind of example of a great liberal country, but never democratic. Do you think that's something we could have realistically tried to do there as a different approach?
I think it quite possibly could. Bearing in mind that US troops now in Germany are more there for convenience, for basing and so on, rather than any other deterrent, or certainly it's not an occupying force at all. Hasn't been for many years.
More's the pity, yeah.
But I think what you would need for that to succeed is continuity, and this is where politics lets us down, because politics is cyclical. Politics is becoming increasingly divisive. You're for something or you're against something. You're for an interventionist strategy overseas, or you're not. And all of a sudden in the United States, and this is where where the catalyst was for the very rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a Trump promise that US troops would leave Afghanistan. It wasn't a Trump promise that it would be chaotic, shambolic, and an embarrassment for the international community. I think that all comes down ultimately to the execution rather than leaving. But I think we can really look at an analogy with the National Health Service. We know that there is something there to be built on, to be reformed, to provide a service to us that could be, but isn't, the envy of the world. But it requires political will, and it also requires politics ultimately to be taken out of it. If you wanted success in Afghanistan, we needed to take the politics out and put the measures, the benefits front and center, and continue that across governments. It's not going to happen with the National Health Service. For it to succeed, you need to take the politics out and give it the resources that it needs to do what it needs to do. So I think, to be honest, when we talk about the situation in Afghanistan and elsewhere, it's a political mess as much as anything else. And I think we've, chuckled previously about the saying that, to really mess things up, it doesn't take a computer, it takes government. There isn't a problem that government couldn't make worse.
No, that's very true. Yeah, very true. So obviously you do know a lot of people that have fought there, and coming back to maybe some of those individuals and people that served there as more generally. How do you think the military feels generally, and perhaps some of the veterans, about the pullout that we've just had?
Yeah, I think you can add to this list, but gutted, angry, let down, misled, even conned. The covenant between government and its armed forces in this instance has been severely damaged. It was damaged after Iraq, and it's been severely damaged now. We can see that there's a tip of an iceberg here. There's the government assurance over the safety of Afghan interpreters, those people who worked most closely with us and put themselves at most personal risk. There were other contracted supporters as well. But there's a symbol here of discontent and mistrust in government. There were some 3,000 interpreters who expressed a wish for resettlement in the UK, and anything between 90 and 650, that's a big spread, 90 and 650 may have left Afghanistan before the withdrawal, what I might call the retreat from Kabul, known as Operation Pitting, the emergency evacuation from Kabul itself. Who knows what the actual figures are? You can't trust the government with them. Johnny Mercer in Parliament has asked for figures so that he can then move resources around that he's got at his disposal, people on telephones, people on emails, to try and make contact with those Afghans who wanted to leave, who may now be in other countries surrounding Afghanistan, trying to make their own way out as best they can. So good people here are doing their best to stay in touch with those who fought alongside them. The fight now, to be honest, is against the incompetence of officials. Only last week we heard that there was a reply to all on an email, which gave the names and other details of interpreters still waiting to leave. We've had a senior official in the Ministry of Defence who left very sensitive papers with regard to Afghanistan, with regard to our aircraft carrier deployments in the South China Sea behind a bus stop in Kent. I mean, these are the sort of incompetencies, most of them with no ultimate accountability and absolutely no justice. I mean, there will not be adequate justice against those officials in terms of the damage that they've done. That again is just an erosion of trust between soldiers, between officials in the Ministry of Defence, and even the most senior officers who are clearly politicized by the time they get into the highest echelons of the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office, and their dealings with Downing Street. And their interests would appear to be other than directly in the interests of the troops that they had the privilege and honour of commanding previously. And then finally, I think for me, if you're going to just throw trust away as glibly as this government has been, you just need to look at the promises made by the Prime Minister in that he said as an election promise that he would establish a cabinet post for a Minister of Veterans Affairs. These posts exist in the United States and elsewhere in administrations worldwide. That's been broken. He has not established a cabinet post for a Minister of Veterans Affairs. He did establish a post for a junior minister, underfunded, under-resourced, and we know that Johnny Mercer MP resigned or was pushed out of that post simply for asking for more and asking the difficult questions. The trust has broken down, the covenant has been severely damaged, and we still have a situation whereby veteran homelessness, mental health challenges, suicides amongst our former members of the armed forces are not yet known about. There is no collation, there is no ability to see just how big a challenge this is. And this is down to a Prime Minister who's made the promises, has broken the promises, and from an armed forces perspective, simply can no longer be trusted. That's bad news for all of us.
Yes, absolutely. It's amazing that we can allow thousands of people to cross the channel every week in dinghies, but can't support 3,000 interpreters that supported our armed forces. That just how does that show any credibility? But we know that only too well. So perhaps winding it out slightly. It's been 20 years since 9/11. That was the catalyst for the last 20 years of military operations. What do you think? A bit of a perhaps crystal ball gazing, I understand, but what do you think might be the military threats to Britain for the next 20 years?
Well, it's not going to be right-wing extremism, that's for sure. Whether these are military threats, I don't think it necessarily needs to be seen in a military context. These threats are certainly going to be from foreign and domestic actors. I think they're going to be other than in organized groups which bring about their own challenges, countering the lone wolf attacks. I think we're going to see more of these. We can be reassured to a degree from the head of MI5 recently, who said that in the last couple of years there have been some 31 terrorist attacks thwarted in the final phases of an attack being put in place, which is good news. But I think we really are going to suffer from the lone wolf, the unaffiliated attack on us in some form or fashion. And that's going to come from what we're seeing already, the increasing breakdowns we've got in our own community cohesion here, where citizens of our own country have interests that are not in our collective security. They're not in our collective prosperity. Those are not their priorities. They have agendas to act against us and to act even against our own nation state. I think our security services and others are truly going to be pressed more over time than they have been previously, as a result of what we've done in Afghanistan, as a result of what we've left festering in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And they're going to have to they're going to need significant additional resources to deal with what I think is still to come as a consequence of letting down those countries with whatever it was that we set out to do in the first place.
Well, you mentioned additional resources there. So, we're one of only 7 blue water navies in the world. And I think I'm going to mispronounce this, but the AUKUS, however that's said, deal demonstrates our naval strength. We've got an incredibly strong air force, and we've just fought in 2 recent rather large land wars or not just wars, but positions there. What do you think are our military strengths, and where do you think we still do need to strengthen?
Yeah, the AUKUS, I think that's how it's pronounced, deal. I think it shows that in terms of technology, in kit, and capability that comes through having good equipment, we've always been strong there. But none of that kit was involved in the aftermath of things in Iraq. None of that kit had any bearing on ultimately our retreat from Kabul. What affected that was the human side of it. How you I'm trying to think of the term now, whereby, you know, do we equip people, or do we man equipment? We appear at the moment to be going towards manning equipment, but equipment doesn't solve the problem. Ultimately, it's boots on the ground. When I first joined the military at the end of the 1970s, we had 150,000 troops alone in Germany. Our armed forces strength now, Army, Navy, and Air Force total, is about 145,000. Now, that's the smallest, or at least the second fewest, that our armed forces strength has been since 1900. Strange that you should think that you know, a conservative government might be pro-defense, but actually it's under conservative governments that our armed forces have contracted most over time. The army itself has been literally hollowed out. There is no resilience left in it, and when you add to that the increasing loss in trust in our government, it's going to make our armed forces increasingly less effective as a result. Our Navy is about 30,000 strong. It's tiny, 70 ships. Our armed forces are now at 82,000, plus a 30,000 reserve, although that number for the reserve is very difficult to actually ascertain day to day. 82,000 troops, when you bear in mind that from a sustainability perspective, you actually need enough troops to be involved in continuous professional training, to manage their development and their education. That requires some sort of margin, but that's regarded as slack, a bit of fat that can be trimmed away, where actually it's one of the most important aspects of armed forces is that they're capable and trained, ready to go. They need resilience within the armed forces to cope with those who are physically and mentally downgraded for whatever reason, and in the process of rehabilitation. But you've got the crazy situation now whereby our armed forces, as small as they are either training for operations, they're on operations, or they're recovering from operations. That is not a good state to be in. It's not good for personnel well-being. It's appalling for their families. They're going to become the HGV truck drivers of the future, the people who don't get time for a shower, don't get the downtime, don't get the time that they need for their own personal and professional development. The analogy I'll use here is one of an insurance policy. You pay your premiums on the basis that you hope you don't have to make a claim, but you may have to. When you make that claim, there's got to be the resource to be able to satisfy it. We've got ourselves into this crazy position at the moment whereby we have an armed forces, but as far as the bean counters are concerned, we should either use it or lose it. And at the moment, I'm afraid we're on diminishing returns. We're losing capability, we're losing effectiveness, and in areas of defense, I'm afraid you can't leave the door with too few locks on it.
No, excellent. Thanks, Peter. It's been really interesting to get your insights into what's an incredibly important story.
Yes, Peter, that was really interesting, actually. Who knows? You mentioned the HGV drivers. There's talk of getting the army chaps to drive the lorries to get the petrol to the petrol stations. So we may actually see some of that. But as you say, if there's no slack in the system, the people won't even be able to do that, let alone if they're really called upon to serve the nation.
No, I mean, our armed forces drivers still have to go through the DVLA licensing application systems. They still have to do their continuous professional competence training to remain in date. They still have to do their hazardous cargo testing and training and so on. There are so many things here whereby the military is the solution. It's not the answer. There isn't necessarily the capability. There's not necessarily the expertise or the qualifications to actually do something that may be ultimately useful to us. And certainly it's not an efficient way of doing things. It's not a cost-effective way of doing things. It's delivering capability, but at huge expense.
So, Mike, we've got a few things on our website and an event coming up. Why don't you tell the listeners about those?
Absolutely. So start off with our event. It's great to be able to get out and meet up again. And we've talked quite a lot about lockdown on here and the loss of our freedoms. Well, we've got an event called No Passports Required. It links up with Dick Denningpole's Third Wednesday Club. And their libertarian drinks. So we're looking for a drinks for freedom lovers, really. Our first one, brilliantly, is on the second Wednesday of the month, just because we're both busy on the third one. But it's Wednesday, the 13th of October from 7 p.m. downstairs at the Milan Bar in Croydon. Come along if you can. It'd be great to see as many of you as possible. Come for drinks, speak to like-minded liberty lovers. And we hopefully have a good night. And we're trying to get these up and running fairly regular occurrence. So that's the 13th of October, downstairs at the Milan Bar in Croydon from 7 p.m. We've spoken to a number of people since our last podcast, one of which was Roald Reib, Capitalist Party of Norway representative. Really good to speak to him about their party and what they believe in. Not an obvious place you think of libertarian politics, Norway, but it really found it interesting to speak to people around the globe and see politics there. Obviously not an EU member and what that means to them. We had an article up regarding talking about Wetherspoons, regarding of Tim Martin's finally getting to meet his great hero Dan Heaton, Wetherspoon's greatest customer, at a TPA event, looking at their Quids In campaign. So Dan went along to that. They're looking at reducing the tax on beer and helping struggling pubs and other venues up and down the country. There's a petition on our website. Have a look at that and sign up if you're interested. We've got a few articles then from Josh. So Josh Ashkoth, who writes for us regularly. Some really interesting articles on free banking theory and the history of money, of the monetary sphere, about how to free banks from central banking and what's there. There's an article in defense of free trade and saying the anti-free trade position returns, and Josh's thoughts on that and how we should be driving towards free trade. And then a slightly more satirical article on undead capitalism. What will be the effect on time preference interest rates if humans were immortal, and what immortality would do to economics. So worth an enjoyable read.
If you'd like to write for our website or have any stories that you'd like us to cover, please do contact us. You can do so via the Twitter at CroydonConst, via our Facebook page, via our website, croydonconstitutionalist.uk, or via our email, croydonconstitutionalist@gmail.com. Well, do please subscribe to the podcast and the pubcast and the YouTube channel. Do please like, share, and leave a review. It's always good to get feedback, and it helps others to find the podcast. I'd like to thank Peter once again for joining us on the podcast and giving us these military insights. It's always good to talk with you, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed for having me again. And thank you to both of you, Dan and Mike, for the great work you do for the cause. Let's put it that way.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Hopefully see as many of you as we possibly can on the 13th. Of October. But yes, thank you to you all for listening. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.